you, first of all, to the organisers. I've really enjoyed this conference the last few days. There's been a lot of inspiring talks and discussions throughout of it. What I'm going to do today, because over the last couple of days, we've heard a lot about the question of the mixed economy and a lot of discussions on the former socialist countries in Eastern Europe and so forth. What I'm going to look at is the sort of post-socialist capitalist countries in Eastern Europe, and to consider to what extent these are mixed economies, and look at this through Marx's theory of primitive accumulation. In the sense that they are mixed economies, I mean, something which Professor Lu-Zixu said yesterday in his speech is that in China, as a socialist economy, the public economy and public capital remains dominant. What happened in the Eastern European countries is the process reversed this reality and made private capital and the market the dominant force within these economies. However, elements remain from the previous system, and these remain important structures within the so-called post-socialist economies. I put inverted commas around post, basically to remain optimistic. So if we look at the transition or transformation in Central and Eastern Europe, this is a unique event, an historically unique event, that capitalism was formed out of some form of socialist economy. It was not something which was predicted, and I would say it's still something which is relatively poorly understood, in the sense of the centrality of this overthrow of the former socialist countries and reintroduction of capitalism, and to what extent that this has been an important and central element of modern capitalist development and capital accumulation, or simply the benefits which international capitalism and the developed capitalist, dominant capitalist countries gained from the opening of the Central Eastern European economies to capitalism, the monopolization of large sections of their economies, the opening of markets for goods, and access to an educated and relatively cheap labor force. These were important elements and remain important elements of the process of capitalist development in the world today. Also, however, to understand this process, as I said earlier, is to understand the nature of not just the process of a transformation, but the nature of capitalism in the post-socialist countries today. Then it helps to return to the theory of primitive accumulation. So just to return, I'm sure people are aware of these aspects. I hope people can read this slides okay. If we turn to the question of primitive accumulation, this was originally used by Marx and in the first volume of Capital to describe the origins of capitalism as a sense, to sum it up briefly, a form of state-enforced expropriation, the use of the state and the use of political violence in order to expropriate property, wealth, and so forth, and essentially a social process used to divorce the producer from the means of production, which is the necessity in order for the free development of capitalist relations. So during the original creation of capitalism, this primitive accumulation from feudalism, then laborers, workers were separated from the means of production and subsistence. This was primarily via the expropriation of the agriculture producer from the soil, and the destruction of petty commodity production. And we see, you know, for example, the whole description by Marx of the Highland clearances in Scotland and so forth, which led the way for the development of capitalism. So essentially what it was doing was creating a social relation which is necessary for capitalist development. And Marx described it like this: on the one hand, in order for capitalism to exist, you have to have the owners of money, the means of production and subsistence, who are eager to increase the sum of values they possess by buying other people's labor power. On the one hand, you need this class of people, but capitalism can only develop if, on the other hand, you have a class of free laborers who survive through selling their labor in conditions of market exchange. And so in the original transformation to capitalism, you have, as I said, you know, the expropriation of the agricultural producer, the peasant, and the destruction of small petty commodity production and so on. Marx simply described this. This is from the first volume of Capital.
Sorry to intervene, Gavin, just could you please make full screen because the attendees cannot see the small letters.
Is this better?
Yeah, it's better. Thank you so much.
Sorry about that. So the quote from Marx can be that the so-called primitive accumulation, therefore, is nothing else than the historical process of divorcing the producer from the means of production. It appears as primitive because it forms the prehistoric stage of capital and of the mode of production corresponding with it. Now, this idea of primitive accumulation has been taken on after Marx and has been seen, because if you read in the first volume of Capital, you read about what Marx wrote about primitive accumulation. Although he writes about it within the process of the origins of capitalism, he never anywhere says that it should be restricted to this. And many Marxists came to recognize how primitive accumulation is a constant process where, in order to maintain the accumulation of capital, that you have to continue to commodify elements and open up parts of social life which are closed to commodity production. And Rosa Luxemburg was famous in doing this, and where she believed that capitalism expanded through an extension into non-capitalist markets. Now, of course, I'm not going to go into the discussion around Luxemburg's accumulation of capital, you know, the disputes and problems with this, about that capitalism exhausts itself once it has expanded into all the non-capitalist areas. Leaving this aside, and the question of realization and so on, she was one of the first to grasp the significance of this and this imperialist expansion. Not alone, of course, Lenin and so on were writing similarly, but she was one of the first to use this question of primitive accumulation and what she called untrammeled accumulation. Also within the capitalist states, primitive accumulation is continually occurring. The state is removing obstacles to the commodification of labor and social relations, so rolling back welfare protections, making workers and people more reliant upon selling their labor in order to survive. And there is a constant attempt to remove the protections of labor in society and make them reliant upon selling their labor and commodity and creating commodity relations. So this is a social process which continues and is a permanent element of capitalism. In the post-socialist situation, we have a new dialectic, because we have a new creation of capitalism, but out of a different economic system. Capitalism faces an industrialized economy. It wasn't the historical role of capitalism within the transition in the post-socialist countries to industrialize and urbanize the populations. This had already happened. And in fact, at the beginning of the transition, many argued that we couldn't call this a process of primitive accumulation, because actually there had been a deaccumulation of capital and a destruction of capital. The sociologist Michael Burroway makes this point. In my opinion, this misunderstands capital accumulation. you can have a deaccumulation of physical capital and a deaccumulation, deindustrialization. What is important for capitalism is that you are creating this social relation. You are making people and workers reliant upon selling their labor to the capitalist. So what is different here? Capitalism could not expand and dominate and monopolize Eastern Europe if the barriers to capital accumulation were not removed. And in the post-socialist countries, in socialism, there existed a class of laborers and industrialized workers. However, large parts of their existence was decommodified. And for example, through the policy of full employment, having a policy of full employment similar to what you had in Eastern Europe at this time was completely impossible within in a capitalist country. All the state's monopoly control over production, over investment and trade, these had to be removed politically in order to allow capitalism to grow. And therefore, the task of the shock therapy reforms was to remove these barriers, which are often violently done, undemocratically done, and so forth. And this is the process of primitive accumulation at the beginning and the creation of capitalism within the post-socialist countries. So what we end up with, I mean, this is a long story, of course, but this is what you end up with is in the form of a sort of post-socialist capitalist countries. So these are capitalist countries, but have elements of mixed economy within them. The transformation from socialism to capitalism is a prolonged one. It's a long one, despite the rapid shock therapy reforms which brutally introduced capitalism within the region. So it's a rapid, sort of shock start to transformation to capitalism, but the process is ongoing, and this is untrammeled accumulation which we can return to. And I would just point to two elements when we're looking at the sort of mixed elements of the post-socialist economies now, is that we see on one side some of the remaining physical structures and institutions, some of which remain from the previous system. And we also have the element of labor and the social relation, again, some of which, some non-commodified elements remain in the post-socialist capitalist economy. Of course, these two are entwined. I'll try to show you this quickly in some examples. So many structures from the socialist era survive. I mean, even to this day, if you look within the Eastern European economies, many elements of the state productive system, of industries and so on, have remained or been privatized and become private monopolies, but were created within the capitalist economy. Of course, many have been destroyed in order that imperialism can dominate in the world economy, but some elements remain. We also see that, in fact, if we look at the welfare systems in these countries, that some physical and human infrastructure from the socialist structure remain in these societies, remain extremely important, as well as industries, an educated workforce, public services, housing, universal education, universal health, etc., etc. These remain elements which are in continual danger and have been downgraded, and all of this sort of neoliberalization of these countries, they still remain important elements. You can see this, for example, if you look at GDP per capita in the world, in the top 50 countries, there's only two post-socialist countries which are in the top 50. That's Slovenia and the Czech Republic, which are in 47th and 50th place. That's GDP per capita. If you take the Human Development Index of which takes in GDP, education, health, life expectancy, etc., you see there's 10 post-socialist countries in the top 50. The top is Slovenia, which is 22. Russia, for example, has an HDI. It is at the level of 52. If you look at GDP, then it's 77th in the world. So these are elements of the previous welfare system, providing, real physical protections to people within these societies. You also have another element. If you look at the major impact of the shock therapy reforms was to create mass employment, was to push millions of people into unemployment, millions of people into poverty, and to create these conditions, which was completely necessary for capitalism to survive, to make the working class be reliant on selling their labor, and to have real fear that they could lose it, that they could lose their work and be thrust into poverty. What also happened at the beginning of the transition in some countries, and it happened later, for example, in Russia, but if you look at, like, for example, in Poland, where I am at the moment, was that in the early years of the transition, the early 90s, government created lots of new social benefits. It was things, there was a huge rise in pension spending, simply because you couldn't politically survive if you didn't provide some protections to the people who had been thrust into unemployment, poverty, and so forth. So a lot of people went into early pensions, early retirements, and so on. If you look at the welfare state in these countries nowadays and the benefit system, you can see from this period a lot of the contradictions of this time emerge. You also have other unique welfare structures and social relations. For example, public land, dachas, free health, education, and so forth, which are completely out of sync to countries at this level of economic development. I remember the first year I was in Poland, a student of mine invited me to go to their country home, as I call it. I thought they were going to be really rich. I'd never met anybody with a country home before. And I went to their country home, and it was a kind of dacha, sort of looking back. We went for a walk, and I asked them, can we walk here? Are we allowed to walk here? As somebody from Britain, where you just got enclosures everywhere. And of course you can. Because essentially with forests and so on, these remain public land, you can walk where you want. So these are, this is elements of...
Gavin, you have 2 minutes.
Okay, elements of a previous system which remain as structures within the current system. Just want to show you very quickly something which can show this, like at the moment. If you look here, these are nursing professionals and hospital beds in the European Union. And if you look on the left-hand side, or look on the right-hand side, where you have in the European Union states, you can see when it comes to the number of nurses, most of the countries who have the least number of nurses in the European Union are from the post-socialist countries. If you go to the other side, and you will see most of the countries in the European Union in terms of numbers of hospital beds per 100,000 inhabitants are from the post-communist countries. What we have here is the remaining infrastructure from the socialist countries, as in infrastructure, hospitals, beds, and so on, which still remain significant in these countries. But we have, from the commodification of labor and from the opening into the division of labor in the world after a period of shock therapy, mass emigration, people moving out of the professions, and so on and so forth. And this creates the contradiction you can see today. So on one hand, we have protections of the infrastructure, but the human capital has been destroyed or has left. And you can see just very quickly, this shows the number of deaths and births in Poland over the last 20 years or so, and you can see coming up to the COVID crisis, what happened in these countries once Eastern Europe went away from its initial strong position of lockdown and essentially followed what I would call, this is the Swedish model in East European conditions. You have the biggest rise in excess deaths, mainly because we don't have the personnel to keep people alive. And one very final thing, sorry, this is in Polish. But I was going to talk as well just the way in which these infrastructures from the past embed themselves within the social consciousness of the population. On the left, you can see these are people that think that these sectors of the economy should be in state hands, in majority state hands or completely in state hands. If you see the two columns coming down on the left, you can probably understand a lot of this. The banks, power stations, healthcare, so on and so forth, extremely high support in the population remaining for state ownership within the population. And again, this is something because these are things which are normal, you know, and people expect these things, even if the reality of 25 years or so of transition has led to a different form of variety. So in conclusion, I'd say that using this framework of the primitive accumulation, we can start to understand the remaining mixed nature of the capitalist countries within the post-socialist world.